So you know that Dan Carlin? Yeah. You know Dan Carlin. Hardcore History Dan Carlin. The podfather of history shows. The greatest, most influential dude in this sphere. Yeah, that Dan Carlin. I says to him, Oi Dan, fancy shooting the breeze for the best part of an hour and 40? And he was all like, do I? No, I'm only mucking about, of course. It didn't go down like that. But in all honesty, I'm honoured and flattered that he'd give me some of his time. Of course, he's used to chatting with such titans as Joe Rogan, Sir Max Hastings, Sam Harris, like 4-star generals, James Burke, Mike Duncan, Dave Rubin, Tom Hanks. I mean, the list goes on. His historical perspective is so respected that he was invited to a CENTCOM meeting to give his thoughts. CENTCOM. Yeah, the US Military Central Command. Arguably one of the most powerful cabals of humans on the planet. So that's his sort of level. Internet royalty, Hollywood A-listers, and the very pinnacle of US military top brass. And now he's talking to your humble old history bro. Remarkable, really. Very kind of him. I must admit, I did feel a little bit like Wayne and Garth at the feet of Alice Cooper. But I think I held it together okay. Alright, without any further ado, here's my interview with the legendary Mr. Daniel Carlin. Well, Dan, first of all, thank you very, very much for giving me some of your time. I really, really appreciate it.
No worries. Happy to do it.
Well, first of all, I've listened to a lot of you do a lot of interviews, and people ask the same sorts of questions, so I'll try not to do that too much. But one of the first things I wanted to ask you was, I've been inspired by history sort of my whole life, and I suppose it's come down from my earliest childhood, going to certain historic places and some specific books as childhood. I just wondered if it's not too impertinent to ask, if there's anything from your childhood that particularly sort of fired your imagination or set you up for, an adulthood of being interested in history.
It's one of those things, especially when you make a living off of it and you wonder, how to maybe tap into it better. I mean, when you start making a living off something like history, you start examining why you like it, how you could tap into that vein better, because it's a matter of dollars and cents or pounds and shillings at a certain point, right? I buy books on creativity and read what other people in creative fields do to sort of bump up their output or their inspiration or their muse. And so I've examined that a lot. My mother always thought it was something, she gets a little interesting about some of these things. She always thought it was something held over from a past life, because she says I was like this from before I could share ideas with her. I don't know about that. I just remember I would get into different subjects extremely deeply, almost obsessively for a limited period of time, and then move on to another subject and get the same way about it. And of course, never forgetting the information I learned earlier. And so when I started doing the gig that I'm doing now, all of these shows are rooted in one of those time periods in my past when I was obsessively interested in whatever the heck topic we're talking about today, and developed a little foundation of knowledge for it. So my mom was an actress, and she did a film in London in the early 1970s. And so we had to go move there for a little while. And I became obsessively interested in what I thought was the history, but we'll call it the legend of King Arthur. That's a perfect example of the kind of things that would obsess me for 7 months or a year or something. And I was walking around on the street asking random British passersby for any info they had on King Arthur when I was about 6.
And then you get a bit older and you read Geoffrey of Monmouth is sort of the main source, isn't it? I think it's quite a serious side of the Arthurian legends.
If you want to get to some of those, you can get really granular, get into like the Welsh sonnets and all this stuff. I mean, it gets crazy deep after. I bet the tail starts eating the head somewhere along the line in that line of mythology.
I wanted to ask you about uni, because you said loads of times that you was a history major, as I was. I've got a BA I did ancient history actually. And one of the things I wanted to ask you, what actual courses did you do at uni? I'd be fascinated to know. Was it modern history, modern American history?
So this is why probably I didn't go farther into history, because as you know, as you go farther along, you're expected to specialize more and more, because that's how you get really good at something. But I'm too interested in too many things. I could never sacrifice my interest in this thing to go for that. So that was always my problem. And so where I went to school, when I went to school there, they didn't give you a degree in a specific branch of history. So your degree just said history on it. And you were supposed to work with your counselor or your academic advisor to tailor your coursework towards a specific discipline. And so when I walked in there, you're allowed to take sort of the general stuff for a while. And then you walk in there and they say, okay, it's time to get specific. Let's talk about what you're interested in. And all I could find that was sort of equally interesting to me, no matter which historical period or region you were talking about, was the military aspect of it. Right. And so we had to, you sort of craft a course load then that ties into that. So it didn't turn out to, it's sort of, if you think about it, like an a la carte buffet or a custom schedule. So they would throw me into a lot of courses that had to do with straight up military history, but then you'd take courses like, I remember one specifically, sociology of peacemaking, right? Because you've got to be well-rounded on this subject. You can't just take war courses. You have to do all this. So it was, if you looked at it, you would say, oh, that's an interesting schedule. And it turns out to be just sort of this eclectic military history major sort of deal. But it involved some of the most fascinating courses I took in college, everything from modern German history, 19th, 20th century, to my senior thesis course was on it was called Selected Readings on Ancient History. And so there was a wide variety of stuff I was into, and it completely explains why I could never specialize and become a historian.
That's really good, though. I mean, that sounds like you've got quite a free reign. That sounds great. I would have
you might say unfocused if you weren't being so nice, but you could go either. It depends on whether you like me or hate me, I suppose.
Well, I wanted to keep it fairly light, but I did want to ask you one or two sort of more serious, pressing, sort of highbrow questions. One of the ones I'd like to ask you about sort of what Toynbee might have called the shape of history as it exists in your mind. All different people have, I suppose, a different lens or different prisms, the way they view history. I mean, I know in my mind, it's just sort of a timeline. When I learn new things, I just sort of slot them into this timeline. But I just wondered, it's quite an abstract thing to ask in a way, difficult to really conceptualize, or might be difficult to answer, but the sort of the shape of history as you view it, does that make any sense to you? Like, for example, Toynbee talked about, and Spengler before him talked about splitting the world history into different civilizations, whether you think that sort of thing is helpful or not.
Yeah, actually, I not only understand your question, it's something I actually think about a lot. But let me split it up into two separate questions because I want to answer them two different ways. The first side would be how I feel about those various theories that you were talking about, the various big picture conceptions, rhythms of history, patterns of history, larger sort of universal tie-in theories to history, and then how I organize my own thinking. Because I think, and I, it's hard to do this because we're all wired a certain way. And so it's difficult for us to imagine the way other people who are hardwired differently see things differently, but I can sort of imagine how they might. And the way my brain is organized, and I have found a lot of people who like histories is similar. It's like you said, it's in a limited, it's in a linear fashion based on events and the passage of time. Right. And so I organize things based on, okay, this is what happened before, this is where we are now, and here are the myriad patterns and choices in the future we might end up in. And a lot of people do that, but I've met people who see numbers, and they're heavy duty mathematician people, and they see reality the way I see it, timeline and linear. They see it in numbers and mathematics. And so I guess what I'm saying is I can only see things the way I do, but in the way that my brain is organized, it's organized in a historical fashion, and a lot of people's are. To me, that's the obvious way one might see reality, but that I would say that, wouldn't I, being one of those people. So the other question you asked about the Spengler, Toynbee, all the different, I don't have a theory. I enjoy comparing and contrasting all those other ones out there. And then sometimes as events unfold around us, trying to decide in my head if that means, oh, should I give more weight to this view now, or is this evidence, or does this disprove this long? So I'm a guy with popcorn sitting on the couch watching these theories play out in real time, enjoying the process and keeping score, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah, no, I mean, I feel quite the same as you. I've heard you say a few times, that when you do an undergrad in history, you realize how much you're not a real
Yeah, yeah,
historian.
absolutely,
um,
absolutely. I'm very respectful of the historians out there.
yeah, absolutely. Yeah, you realize actually the sort of rigor it takes to be a PhD in history is actually.
And the depth of commitment to a specific piece of subject matter, like we were just
Mm.
talking about. You really have to live it, man. You really do.
Oh, that was the other thing I was actually going to say just about uni as well. I don't. Did you have this? When I finished uni, I was done reading about the Roman Republic for a couple of years. It sort of ruined my inspiration for that a bit because I drilled down so far into it for a few years, and that's worn off now. I've read so much more since my uni days. But did or at least the topic that you did your dissertation on, your thesis on, did it ruin it at all by drilling down so far into it? Or if you did one of your really long podcasts about World War One, for example, are you sort of done with World War One for a while after that?
Yes, yes, I am. And listen, you just we've dovetailed back into the original conversation. I mean, imagine if you had decided you were going to be a Roman Republican historian, and you got to the end of your studies, you're just about to commence your long career in the field, and you're already burned out. So I think I managed to ditch that by flitting around to all these different eras and places, all of which I would become, as I said, intensely interested for a while, but not enough to spend my entire life on it to the exclusion of all the other things that might be out there. I am living proof, though, that you don't just have to become a history teacher or a historian to make good use of a history education. It's one of those sort of catch-all educational subjects, I think, that helps you in ways that you can never quantify or foresee in advance. You just turn around and realize down the road, wow, that turned out to be, when I got into the news business, I found out that some of the best reporters that I most admired were history majors. And it makes total sense after you realize it, but I never would have been able to say while I was at school, oh, you know what? A lot of history majors go into the news business. But after I realized it, I went, well, of course they do. Don't they say that journalism's the first draft of history? It makes perfect sense at that point.
Yeah, now I think a history degree it really, really helps me in life, not with potentially getting a job, but with being questioning sources, questioning pretty much everything you hear and who's saying it and why. That's a really valuable thing. I see a lot of adult people walking through life and they're not doing that and they're being led astray all over the place because, well, anyway, that's just an aside, really. I hadn't really
Well, there's a
planned to
ton of
say that.
subsidiary effects too. I mean, most
Yeah.
people who graduate with even a BA in history can write rather well. I mean,
Mm.
it's one of the side benefits of the gig.
Mm.
So I would suggest that from an organizational idea, from a conceptual, from an idea expression point of view, I mean, there's a lot of subsidiary skills that come with the major that I think an employer, for example, would find beneficial across the board.
Yeah, having the skill to form an argument. Yeah, that's not an insignificant thing. But one of the other things, sort of questions I wanted to ask you, so maybe a little bit more serious, is about it's probably well trodden ground, but about the idea of historical objectivity. What your feelings are on that, if you think it exists. I mean, can we ever know what actually happened in the past? I mean, of course, I think that the past is profoundly lost to us. Every moment that goes by can never be truly recaptured. But then, does that mean that the historian's job is only ever to form some sort of narrative, however fictional, and that you're engaging in, to be unkind, a sort of confidence trick with your audience? Or do you think that the historian can sort of dissolve himself and present something like an objective picture of the past?
I would suggest we can't provide an objective picture of the present. So expecting that we could do that with the past seems ridiculously optimistic to me.
Mm.
But that doesn't mean we can't know things about the past. We can't understand it because there are. I love some of the pieces of art over time, whether we're talking about plays or television shows or movies or books that have examined different potential realities, for example, or the multiple ways you can view the same situation. I mean, you don't have to go very far to see the historical examples of, for example, the Romans reinterpreting Greek history when they themselves had a chance to sort of think about it, and figures that were villains in Greek history could be turned into heroes in Roman history. It's just one of the many examples of how one would view the past and the facts of the past. Right? Julius Caesar lived. That's a fact. Is he a good guy or a bad guy? Well, that's where we start to get to the question of objectivity, viewpoint, lenses. Are we looking at it from the Roman side, or are we looking at it from the Gallic side? The short answer to your question, and it's the one I've always given, is no, you can't have any objective knowledge of the past, but that doesn't mean that there aren't things you can say with 99% certainty happened. What they meant, what people thought or felt about them, that's much more subjective stuff.
Right. A truly objective representation of the past isn't possible, but a truth can be agreed upon to some extent.
Or you can say, I mean, today here in the States, we have multiple news stations that have a political, an avowed political point of view. I often think if future historians were only to get one of those making it through the evidence pipeline, right? They had to base their entire history of our times off only one of those stations, right? From one viewpoint. That's an example of how, when I was a kid, you often viewed history, right? This is how it happened. This is what we know. This is what you need to learn and repeat to get an A on the test, that kind of thing. But I think it's much more like if we had access to the sources. And as we all know, the more recent the history, the more likely you're going to end up with multiple choices and sources and whatnot. But that's when you can begin to flesh it out and say, hey, life is three-dimensional, and it only looks one-dimensional to us now because we lack the proper sources. They've been lost to us, or they never existed in some cases, to give us multiple viewpoints, multiple opinions that would have been present at the time had you lived in that environment. So, I mean, I think part of why it appears the way it does is because, you lack the kind of sources that you have when you live in the reality of the times, like right now.
I feel like that's a fantastically rich vein of conversation, but have to move on to some more important things. Who wins in an MMA fight between Hitler and Stalin?
Oh, I think Stalin does.
Really?
I don't think Hitler's that formidable. And Stalin's, I've read stories of him breaking the legs of baby. I mean, I just think Stalin was a real rough and tough revolutionary. Hitler strikes me as a little bit of a poser, not a full poser. I mean, but compared to Stalin, graded on a curve, I'd take my chances with Hitler.
I think they're both probably quite scrappy. If I had to put money on it, I'd go with Hitler just because Stalin had that busted up arm. Wasn't one of his arms pretty badly busted? And
but based on history, Hitler'd make some sort of an agreement temporarily with him and then attack him when he wasn't looking. That just sounds like what would happen. Let's shake hands. Let's go back to our corners. And then bam, in the back of the neck.
Well, one of the things I wanted to do was you've said many a time that sort of your original inspiration for hardcore history was the things that college undergrads talk about at lunchtime. And I think lots of people agree with that. Lots of people love that sort of stuff. I know I do. But one thing I want to ask you, to completely ruin any sort of credibility I might have had with you with talking about Toynbee and Spengler, one thing that's a bit sort of on the edge of sort of proper history, maybe even going into woo-woo. I wanted to ask you about Göbekli Tepe. Do you know much about the site at Göbekli Tepe in southern Turkey? One of perhaps the earliest archaeology.
I know a little bit. If you go too deeply into it, you will lose me quickly, but I do know a little bit about it. Wasn't some of it underwater? Are we talking about the same area?
No, it was a hill. It was a pot-bellied hill.
Okay. So sort of near Hittite territory, Anatolia.
Yeah, down there.
All right.
But it's from 10,000 BC. It even
right.
sort of predates Jericho and stuff, and it just sort of doesn't seem to fit in with the historical framework of when you had pottery and tools. But if you're not particularly well versed,
is this an Atlantean kind of theory? What are we?
Well, there's no real proper theories. I mean, people like Graham Hancock have talked about it. But there's no. I mean, have you got much of an opinion on Graham Hancock at all?
I like everybody because for me it's just all Graham Hancock reminds me of I grew up with In Search of the TV show with Leonard Nimoy and stuff, and I guess that was started by one of the people that I always liked Leonard Nimoy too, but I always liked Rod Serling, and I think he started In Search of, and so for me Graham Hancock reminds me of the kind of questions that they would ask on those shows that I liked so much, and I never have a problem with the questions. I'm not sure that I would use it in a hardcore history show as a source, but I've got Graham's books here at the house. I read them. I enjoy them.
Oh, right. Oh, excellent. Yeah, for me, it's a sort of a strange, I'm interested, of course, but, until you've got really solid proof for things, you have to be
Well,
careful.
but again, I think you also have to be able. I mean, you need those people. They ask questions. I get it. It's weird to me when there's too many. Listen, if you go back and you watch a movie which was based on a book like Chariots of the Gods, which is in that same sort of vein, it looks kind of hokey now for all sorts of reasons. But I remember watching it at the time, and even though the questions were leading, they were very leading questions. The way they usually presented this stuff was with questions. And the answers were not obvious. And so when they'd ask about the Nazca lines in Peru or whatever, and what could have made these, and do these look like aliens? It's not like somebody trying to play a parlor game on you, right? They're not trying to put something over on you, but it's not straight history either. But the questions themselves are legitimate to me anyway. I mean, maybe the person who asked the questions doesn't have to be the one answering them, but I think having somebody raise, I don't have any problem. Like I said, I read them because I'm interested in them too. And I close the books and I often say, now, what the hell was that? I think there's value in that, at least to me.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, well, yeah. There's no, you can't have too much knowledge.
Well, it's even if it leads me in the wrong direction, I like having that part of my brain stimulated so that I'm thinking out. Hancock, that's an outside the box type thinking, right? Von Daniken was outside the box. Now you might go, oh, listen, talk about aliens and history mixed together. That's bad news, but. I like aliens and history, so it's hard for me. I guess what I'm saying is I don't put it into the same category with straight history, but I don't think it has no value either. I enjoy all of it. I enjoy the straight up science fiction stuff. So I might not be the right guy to ask about that.
In your King of Kings, or one of the later ones, King of Kings, you do Alexander.
Everybody gets that wrong. It's Kings of Kings.
Oh, I do
apologize. King of Kings is going to make somebody think it's a Christianity story.
Right, sorry. Yeah,
Kings of Kings is the phrase we're looking for. No worries.
You cover sort of the Alexander legend or history, and I mean I've done one on that, and it was an absolute favourite of mine. So I just wondered. It must have been, as you say before, these are all topics that at some point in your life you were fascinated by. I just wondered if Alexander was, a particular one. It's a lot of people's favourites. I know for me, it's a cornerstone.
Yeah, as a matter of fact, if you actually went down the list of topics we've touched upon, he may be number one for me. I mean, the first episode we ever had was called Alexander versus Hitler. So I think, as a matter of fact, I think somebody said to me once, he goes, you've talked about Alexander the Great so much that the very first printed word of anything in any of your history shows is Alexander. So in answer to your question, yes, love Alexander. The show Kings of Kings really isn't about Alexander per se, except that he's sort of the climactic chapter in that story. I've talked around Alexander for this whole series. I've never done the definitive episode on him because I plan on doing one eventually. So we've talked about the milieu around the Macedonians. We did a show on his mom. We did a show.
That was great.
But we're always so I'm moving around Alexander and basically talking about everybody around the dude, so that by the time we eventually do the Alexander show, it will be like the last piece in the puzzle.
Oh, great. I hate to sound completely sycophantic, but I can't wait for that.
Yeah, it's only going to be probably 26 episodes the way I go. So,
or okay, Dan. What about this one? Imagine the Battle of Gaugamela, and imagine that Alexander's entire army is just sort of quantum leaped out of there. They just disappear. In your opinion, how many SAS guys or Delta Force soldiers do you think it would take to defeat Darius?
You know, there's a great Twilight Zone episode, the one that I don't know if you've ever seen it, but it has to do with a time travel with a tank, or a tank's crew going back to a famous battle with Native Americans, and it reminds me of that a little bit. Although there was a book by Arthur Farrow called The Origins of War, and in the very last chapter, he postulates Alexander's army fighting Napoleon's at Waterloo. Or instead of Napoleon's at Waterloo, in place of Napoleon. It's the same kind of a theory. How many so I'm going to substitute U.S. Marines for SAS, sure. Maybe.
Like Navy SEALs or Delta.
Okay, so here's what we always have to do in these kinds of conversations. You have to start saying, okay, now we have to take into account this. I mean, are the horses scared by the sounds of the guns or not? I mean, how granular are we getting? If we're dealing with psychological effects, it's different than if you just say, okay, we've given Alexander's troops some preliminary understanding of what to expect here. They shouldn't be shocked by any of the capabilities now. So I don't know. I guess the answer to me is not many. I don't think if we say that they can be shocked by the modern technology, then I'd say 10. If we'd say that they're not shocked by the modern technology, I'd say 50,
right,
or less. I mean, what are they going to do? I mean, they're not even going to know how to take cover right away. You know, I mean, they're just going to be standing up there like bowling pins. The cavalry is the only hope they have.
It's interesting because I've asked that to a few different people, and the answers vary wildly from one. Some people say one. As soon as he starts firing automatic fire and people start getting shredded, they're just all going to run away immediately. It'll be the most terrifying thing they could imagine. And others say, no, you're going to need dozens.
You have to account for that. You have to say, does the psychology matter or not? Right? Because that changes the whole equation. Yeah.
I guess it would if you're going to do these sort of thought experiments or sort of war games. You want to. I think I've heard you say before. You want to make it sort of as realistic as possible. Often people say, "Well, how have they got enough ammo? Do you need a guy to sort of just bring in a whole rucksack full of boxes of ammo?" And they get really granular on it. But yeah, I think you'd need at least 10 guys, probably. I mean,
well, everybody forgets, right? They always think, okay, it's a person with an automatic rifle, and no. Anything above the squad level, you're talking about a certain amount of explosives. You're talking about, I mean, they're going to have heavier weapons with them that are going to be, I mean, grenade launchers. I mean, this is all going to be stuff that really changes the equation pretty quickly.
Yeah, maybe 2 or 3 guys bring in a mortar rig. Or something
shrapnel. Like I mean, it's not going to be pretty.
I really wanted to ask you about, I said I didn't want to ask the questions that everyone else asked, but I do want to do a slight variant on one that I've seen you have to answer a few times, but I'll hopefully put a slightly different spin on it. It's the question of what made you pick that. In the Death Throes of the Republic, one of my favourites, it's a tour de force, I think. There's one episode in that, and it's the one where Clodius, the Bonadia scandal. I'm probably not saying that right, but when Clodius was discovered to have been dressing up as a woman, and it was a great scandal to do with Caesar's wife. I just wondered why or how you ended up picking that, because you drilled down into that, you telescoped down into that quite tightly, and for me that was brilliant because well, there's a few times you've done it where I was aware of that episode, but that was it. It was just like another one of the crazy episodes that happened in the age of Pompey and Caesar. But when you did it and when you drilled down into it like that, it gave it so much more color that it sort of transformed Clodius a bit for me. And I just wondered, how that ended up getting into sort of the final edit, if you like. Or whether it's just sort of serendipitous. It just sort of happened and it was good and it ends up getting in.
I have to point out that was many years ago. so my exact thinking, and that was the longest series we ever did, by the way, in terms of the number of segments that were. And so trying to remember the individual reasons, I do remember that we had some level. I always had these sub themes running below the main theme. And one of the sub-themes of that particular segment had to do with the almost like a tabloid, National Enquirer, TMZ side of the Roman they're Kim Kardashians of the day, and all those, and Clodius was involved in what was a tongue-wagging scandal for the day. And I felt like it didn't just flesh out his character, but helped flesh out the tenor of the times, the zeitgeist in highfalutin Roman society, the same sort of stuff that they would say about Julius Caesar when he come in with the toga with the fringe on it, with the high signs that they would flash to the other cool people. So we were setting this sort of stage for how this was the new hip scandalous generation in Roman society, and compare and contrast them with the more stolid older generation that looked as these, they looked at the Caesarian generation a little bit, depending on whose viewpoint you want to take, like we talked earlier, but there's a lens through which you can view this that looks a little like those old-fashioned Romans are looking at these like millennials, right? These Caesar types, and they're all sleeping with each other, and then you got Clodius, he's dressing like a woman, and blah, 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 blah. So I mean, I felt like it was one of those ways to really offset an angle of Roman society that you weren't necessarily getting from the rest of the material. That we were giving a lot of military history, a lot of big figure personality, and I feel like that was we talk about these shows like paintings sometimes, and that was a color that we had not used in this painting either in a while or ever. And so I feel, if I'm remembering it correctly, I feel like that fleshed out the wholeness of the piece, if that makes sense. That's like artsy talk, but I think we think like that around here a little bit.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It definitely did that. Absolutely. It's one of my favorite bits of any of your. It's great.
That's what I bring to the table, man. That's if you want straight history, there are better people than yours truly. I give you that crap. That's my contribution.
If you had to put money on Alexander versus Caesar, because famously you did the Hastings, but I'm not sure I've actually heard you say if Alexander versus Caesar, both at their best, if you had to put money on who would win.
Yeah, okay, then you're gonna have another question. What kind of terrain are we fighting in?
Let's say perfect, just a billiard table. Let's say it's Gaugamela, but
Okay.
Darius's army's gone and Caesar's in his place.
Okay, how many on each side?
Well, let's say 40,000 aside.
Okay. I'm taking Alexander in that terrain, and here's the reason why. People like to compare how the Romans did against phalangites, but they didn't fight Alexander or Philip's phalangites. They fought a much different phalanx that had become brittle, had lost tactical flexibility, and had changed its function on the successor battlefields from one of the anvil that the Macedonian cavalry would hammer onto to one of the main forces that is supposed to win the battle. If they do their job in Alexander's army, their job is to simply keep the legionaries occupied while the cavalry breaks through and hits them from the flank or the rear. And I think Alexander leading his cavalry, I think that would be problematic for Caesar's forces. I think the fact that Caesar could turn his legionaries to face a new flank would help. But I do think that would be problematic for him. Now, I don't think that. I think Caesar facing Alexander or Alexander's father Philip would be problematic. But I bet you, I'm trying to think which of the successors that I would think would beat Caesar too. But I think Caesar beats all those latecomers later. There were a couple of those Macedonian generals that I think would be probably equally as nasty as Alexander.
Seleucus is one of my favorites. I think his record's pretty spotless.
Oh, and if you have his army too, I mean, that's phalangites are probably worse. But that is an army that the Romans almost kind of fought at Magnesia and places like that. If you throw in any bad terrain at all, though, I think Caesar becomes much more trouble. I also think that if Caesar has any time at all, like if you're sitting on that battlefield for 24 hours, then by the time you wake up in the morning, Caesar's troops are going to have built something. You're going to have to deal with that. Every day you're there, they're turning it into like Verdun. So I do think there's a lot of variables that would affect that. Alexander's a very impetuous kind of guy for the most part, although at the siege of Tyre and places like that, he could be very methodical, but Caesar's methodical by nature. So there'd be a lot of variables. If it's a straight up billiard ball table, both sides have been there 5 hours and they're ready, I'd give it to Alexander. But in almost every other circumstance, I think Caesar probably would win.
Yeah, I think that's a great call. I'd agree with you. When I had it in my mind, if it is, like I say, billiard table type terrain, I think probably Alexander's personal presence might be the. It's not that Caesar wasn't or was never in the front line. There are accounts that he was, but I think Alexander, that that's what he does, and that would
Well, and
sort of
isn't that
tip.
the best terrain possible for Alexander? I mean, you pretty much
Mm,
pick the
mm,
best he would. I mean,
mm.
if leveled billiard ball works perfectly for him.
Have you got a favorite emperor or a favorite? It might be someone from the Republican times.
I like a lot. This is the same problem I have with the whole history
Hmm.
major question.
Depends what mood you're in.
Yeah, and I like them for different reasons.
Mm.
I have friends that are like that. I like this guy for that reason. I like that guy for that. When I'm going to do this, I want that friend. When I'm going to do that, I want this other. So I feel the same way about my historical figures. The biggies always fascinate me for the same reason they've fascinated people ever since. I mean, the mind of a Caesar. With Alexander, for me, it's always the reality, because there's so many different ways you can view him. I'm dying to know what he was really like. And one of the things we asked once is, what if Alexander the Great had a podcast?
Hmm.
Imagine how well future historians are going to know us based on their ability to mine stuff like this, right? What if we could mine stuff like this from that era? How much better would you know the personality? I mean, what if Hitler had a podcast? I mean, imagine how well you'd know that, right? With Google translating it for us or something. There's different reasons I'm fascinated. Clearly, Caesar was one of these savants, I think, who just had some kind of a once in a generation brain. And I think those people are inherently fascinating. Alexander, one can argue, he sounds great, but he's one of those many conquerors who inherited a ready-made army by his dad. It's very possible it's like taking over a great sports team and getting all the credit for being the quarterback of that team or the main player on that team, even though that team would have won the championship no matter who was in that role. So in that sense, it's hard for me to separate Alexander from the Alexandrian army, whereas I imagine you could get Caesar and have him switch sides with the other and take the other side in some of the battles he fought. Well, fought a lot of civil wars, so maybe that wouldn't matter as much. But I think Caesar might win on either side, and I don't know how Alexander would do.
Mm, I suppose it's like when someone says, "What's your favorite song?" or "What's your favorite movie?" It depends. If through time, it
Yeah,
depends
yeah,
what mood I'm in
yeah,
on any given
yeah,
day.
exactly right.
But having just said that, do you have a particularly favorite ancient historian? I mean, I'm a massive fan of Tacitus. I haven't done any videos on him yet, but I will do. And he does sort of stand out for me as just an out and out favorite. I don't know if you have one.
Well, what's happened to me is that I use the historians the same way I just explained the other things. And one of the things I'm always trying to recreate in my head are certain long-standing questions. How ancient battles worked, how certain armies were organized, things like that. And so I gravitate toward what I would consider to be the best historians we have on those subjects, the Thucydides, the Polybius, people like that, at the expense of the Herodotus and the Livy, even though they're both wonderful. But I mean, I'm trying to get the best, most accurate idea I can from a time period where that was not always the number one concern of the narrator.
Mm,
So I find myself, Xenophon, I find myself gravitating toward the people that I feel like can give me a better sense of how certain things worked and deal more with realism and less with story, which is a little ironic because I do the opposite. I mean, I'm
mm,
a storyteller, really, if you break it down. But I'm fascinated by having some of, we talked about, I like questions, right? I play in the question game. These are the kind of people I would turn to try to get some satisfaction, or at least pretend satisfaction,
mm,
that I'm getting those
mm,
questions, if not answered, then at least understood by me a little bit better.
mm. Like the idea of being in a hot air balloon over an ancient battle. You've said a few times, and of course that'd be great. I'd like to be alongside
That'd be
you.
great. It
Um,
might not be great. We just think it might not be that great to really.
yeah, it might be the most horrific thing you've ever
Yes,
seen.
exactly. Post-traumatic stress disorder all around.
But if you were to do that somehow, I mean, was there any particular battle that springs to mind where you'd be like, well, I'll go for that one?
Well, I want something that's going to teach me the most. So if you get one shot at this, right? You get one trip in the hot air balloon. Then there's a, this for your listeners who don't know, this relates to my fascination, and a lot of people have the same one about the physics of pre-modern battle, right? The problems with trying to understand the physics of pre-modern battle is the sources that you have often don't explain the obvious things that were obvious to them, but that are not obvious to us. So today, we don't need somebody to break down what the shooting of a gun and what a bullet does. I mean, that's all. We can just say so-and-so shot somebody, and we understand what that means. Just like the people on the other end of these ancient writings understood. You don't need to explain the basics of what everybody knows back then to them, but you have to explain it to us. And so the physics of the battlefield line about being able to float in a hot air balloon, I don't know what I said, a couple 100 feet over the battlefield, is to simply give me an idea of what happens, to give you just one example, when a bunch of horsemen charge, right? Whether we're talking about them charging into other cavalry or charging into stationary infantry, what happens? Do they collide? Do they stop 1 second beforehand and start stabbing at each other? There's a lot of theories. And so, I find myself, and I'm not the only person who does this either, going through footage from some of the more wild riots that have been caught on film over the last 40 or 50 years, because you see enough of the police officers with Roman-like shields trying to maintain order in some sort of phalanx against large crowds of people on the other side. So you see what you try to see. Okay, am I learning anything about the what happens when multiple human beings smash into multiple, and you could also go look at those giant recreations. They're always in Eastern Europe, I seem to think. They always have these giant recreations of battles, and once again, I just have to say they look pretty damn serious when you see the videos of them. I'm wondering how many people get taken to the hospital after those things. But that's for the hot air balloon idea is about gauging the physics of the battlefield. So to answer your question, I want a battle that's going to have enough different elements involved in it so I get to learn about multiple things, right? I don't want to go to one of those battles that's just infantry versus infantry or just close order troops against close order troops. I want to have enough variety in the troop type. So by the time I'm done in my hot air balloon, I know what it's like when cavalry runs into stationary infantry, what it's like when infantry countercharges. I want to see all the scenarios play out. So if I only get one shot at this, I've got as much data as possible. What battle is that? Well, maybe you could pick a Gaugamela. Maybe that works for you, or something like that.
Well, I was thinking there's a couple of Pyrrhus's battles in Italy that are a real ding dong back and forth.
Something. Sure, Asculum. Yeah. Those would be, what are those?
Heraclea was one.
I love the Pyrrhic armies, by the way, and they're not representative either, with all those Italian troops in it, the Samnites and Bruttians. Those people they have with them. Yeah, but that's not a bad one either. That's that's Manipular Legion. So you have the chance to. Nobody knows how the frickin' Manipular Legion really worked in practice, so that would be helpful too. So I'm with you. If you're letting me on your hot air balloon, then I'll combine my experiences at Gaugamela with what I learned from Pyrrhus's campaign in Italy.
Or how about this one, Dan? Do you know a Bradley fighting vehicle? Do you know what that looks like? It's a really, really light tank,
It's an APC,
Yeah, like armored Caterpillar tracks, got a very small turret, not really a massive gun, but like
fires fast though. Fires fast.
Yeah, I think maybe it's like a really heavy machine gun or something. I don't know enough about it, but do you think one of those could take on an entire ancient empire? So let's say the Roman Empire circa Hadrian. Do you think one Bradley fighting vehicle would just destroy the entire empire? There'd be nothing that could be done against it. Or do you think they'd be more savvy and they'd be able to
variables again, man? First of all, okay, we all know that the Roman army's not going to be all on the same field at the same time, because as Hans Delbruck would have told us more than 100 years ago, how would you ever feed them? Right. So you're going to have probably, who knows what they were, 500,000 to 1 million, 750,000, who knows what the entire Roman army was at that time period. If you said 500,000, you'd have a few historians on your side probably, but it's probably only being used in what would you say, a 40,000, 50,000 man field army. Probably some historians would go as low as 25,000. A Bradley fighting vehicle against 25,000 men. I think it comes down to morale again, because I do think and the other questions you brought up, ammunition supply, all those kind of things. And that is really the Twilight Zone episode, because the Twilight Zone episode that I referenced earlier, the last line
Yeah,
in
I haven't seen that.
Okay, so the guys are on maneuvers, and they've got what I think it's a Stuart light tank. What you in Britain they would call them the Honeys. I think they're M3s. And so they've got one of those, and then at the end of the episode, the three guys go to fight in the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and they've got like a submachine gun amongst them and all that. And then the last line by the other guy is, "I wonder, it might have helped if they'd brought the tank." And that got me thinking, okay, one World War II era light tank against, everything that fought at the Battle of the Little Bighorn. It's a similar question. I gotta believe if morale is involved at all, it's the SAS question all over again, right? I'd say it destroys Roman 50,000 man armies, or they run away. But boy, is it perverse to suggest you'd want to see the movie that examines that? I'm the audience for that. When they say, "Is there a target audience for a movie like this?" Yes, there is. It's War of the Worlds, but we're the aliens, right? we're going Bradley fighting vehicle. We're the Martians.
I'm going to try and find that old episode, Twilight Zone episode. It does sound right up my alley.
You know what? It's the way they shoot it. It would have been a great 2.5-hour movie. It's that good of a concept.
Well, I've got to ask you. I absolutely have to ask you about Prophets of Doom.
Okay.
I listened to it straight after I first listened to it, and I've only ever done that once or twice ever. It was that good. About 5-10 minutes in, I realized it was an absolute gem, and I settled down to it. And I've listened to it, I think, 4 times now, which is maybe a bit weird, but I just think it's really, really good. And I've heard lots of other people say that, and I think I've heard you say it's among your favourites. But one thing I wanted to ask you about it was so perfect for me. I don't know if this is why other people like it so much, but I was aware of the wars of religion. I was aware of Luther. I'd heard of Jan Hus, and I was vaguely aware of the Anabaptists. They exist in my mind just as just Puritans. And that was it. I'd never heard of the Siege of Munster. I'd never heard of the other two Jans. And so it was essentially completely new to me. And it just bowled me over. I don't know. It's hard to put my finger on why I think it's so excellent. I just wanted to ask you about, I've heard you also say you have certain subjects that are like your back pocket subjects that you always knew you wanted to do. And that was one of them. So again, unfortunately, I think I've heard other people ask you this, but I just wondered sort of where that came from.
When I was a long time ago, I was, and this is a very long-winded answer, I think. I was a theater major, and one of the things that I was good at was improvisational theater. And one of the things that I noticed when you did a lot of improvisational theater is that your mind started looking for things you could use all the time. So it's like a muscle that you develop because you're going to need it later. And all of a sudden you'd be out on the town, and every time you looked at something, you'd think, oh, there's a funny bit there in there. And in other words, you got good at spotting things where you go, oh, that's going to be good someday. And so fast forward to once upon a time, I read a little something on the Munster question, Jan Leiden and all that. And it was one of those things where the very reason that it was such a good topic and so unknown was an Achilles heel in trying to do the show. And that's that there's not a lot of information on it in English, which is why more people don't know about it. So it opened the door for me to talk about it, but then when I've got to find the information, and I'm one of those guys that likes, because we talked about this earlier in our conversation, as many viewpoints as I can squeeze into it, right, to try to give if we understand that objective history isn't possible, then isn't it better to have multiple views? And so I always like to have multiple views. And in this story, there are so few sources. I mean, if you look at our source list, we always put the show notes on the website for each show. It's one of the sparsest lists of sources that I have, because now here's the downside, is that podcasting is international. So there are countries that listen to that show that have many more sources than I had available to me. There are Dutch people that wrote me, German people that wrote me, and they're able to tell me quite a bit more. But the advantage that we had in that story is when I first heard it, I knew it was so perverse and so weird that this is just it. And it reminded me in the United States, we had an incident. We've had a couple of these kinds of incidents, the Waco incident, or the Jim Jones in Guyana incident.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
this is like the granddaddy of all of those, you know. And there's a couple of in Asia, you know. You've got some major affairs too that are similar. That you've seen these sorts of things in history, right? So it was one of those deals where, because of the lack of sources in English, we had this subject that when people heard it, they were just, oh my God, you're kidding me. Whereas in Germany, they it's much more on the tip of their tongues.
Right.
So yes, in answer to your question, because I look for good topics all the time now, I knew that this was going to be a good one. And I knew that one of the big challenges, and I don't know how well we met it, to be honest, was differentiating the very strange and not representative versions of these religions from the great mass, because the descendants of those religious groups are still around today. And the last thing they want is a misunderstanding of their beliefs or their history because of these outliers. And so the real challenge for that show was trying to walk that line where we can say, well, here's the motivation that these people had, but they don't think anything like the majority of those people who also think a little like, you know. So that was a difficult part. And I would have preferred to have more sources in my native language that I could understand to help flesh that out. But it is one of those stories where you just go, there's something that it tells us about human nature, but I'm not sure what.
Yeah, no, I mean, you talk about the extremes of the human experience, and that's pretty extreme. No, it's just great. I mean, it is morbid curiosity, I suppose, but you know, who doesn't like that, if you're honest with yourself?
Well, it's the original get tough on crime sort of approach, isn't it?
I wanted to ask you about Edward Gibbon. I've asked a few people that are into their history about Edward Gibbon, and I get quite wild answers because I'm a big fan. Obviously, it's dated and there's all sorts of problems with it, but I just really love the prose, the turn of phrase. I wonder if you have an opinion.
Well, that's the problem, is that you can fall in love with a work for reasons other than the things that one would judge a modern history on. I have a similar problem with Hans Delbruck.
Right.
And it's not a prose thing, although I get the prose. I read Churchill for the prose. It is a question of the approach. The way Delbruck's mind works is so fascinating to me that I like the way he analyzes things, even if he's analyzing information that we now know to be out of date, right? So if he's using incorrect numbers, but I like the way he does his math, is he still valuable, right? And so I like Delbruck for the same reason. I find myself going back and rereading him, and I find that he keeps me cynical and grounded when it comes to historical. You know, we talked about the Chariots of the Gods earlier. If I ever get too much that way, I pull out the Hans Delbruck and I'm instantly cured, you know. But in answer to your question on Gibbon, you know, I never fell in love with the work, and I never fell for his view of why Rome fell and all that. Of course, there's so many of those. We could all have our own individual one, can't we? But I love history written from other eras, if that makes sense. It's the same reason I like reading the Roman history and the Greek history. I like reading the history of Gibbon's era, and I feel like with all histories, they tell you something about the era that they were written in and the historian itself. And I feel like I learn about Gibbon's era and Gibbon a lot when I read, and his class and his country and the way they saw the past. I mean, I love, and I'd love to find and maybe there is a good book. Maybe one of your listeners will tweet it to me or something. I've always tried to find a book that tells us how much earlier people viewed even earlier history, right? I'm always fascinated when you have Egyptians from an era we would think was completely ancient doing their own archaeology on kings that are, you know, millennia before them, right? And what did they think about them? So more of that would be, if you're a writer out there looking for something to sell to me, I want to read that book. And that's, to me, to answer your question, that's how Gibbon to me is valuable more as a source for his own times. And like you said, for one of the classic prose writers of that, and the fact that I love historians who take giant topics like that And I mean, I love Will and Ariel Durant, and they're outdated too, but I love them for the same reason. These are giant books that deal. You had talked about Toynbee and Spengler and those kind of things. It's not really that, because it doesn't have that kind of a theory of history element, but it is big history, universal history. And I find that you tie all the things together when you do that, rather than just focusing on, the history of 12th, it wouldn't be 9th century Anglo-Saxon jewelry. It's the opposite of that. It's harder to tie in the jewelry question to the larger trends and forces of the era, much more creativity required.
Yeah, no, I mean, you definitely do get sort of favourite sources, don't you, or favourite historians? I mean, I gather, in your blueprint for Armageddon, which was another tour de force, if I may say so, you talk.
Okay, thank you. I hate everything from my past. I just look at what I change now, but I appreciate the kind words. Thank you.
I think it's really exciting. I've listened to it all the way through a couple of times, and bits of it more than that. You talk about Ernst Junger a fair bit there, which was great.
Love him, yes.
Yeah, and I just wondered, maybe fairly grand question here, but do you think that we still suffer today, today's modern world, from World War One, from the ripples of World War One, and sort of. I mean, are you one of those guys that sees World War One, the intermediary years, and World War Two as essentially one conflict, or not?
That is a better question. I think it would be tough for somebody to actually argue the first question, that it didn't, that we're not still dealing with the ripples, because to me it's so obvious. The Middle East alone should prove the point, right? In my mind, anyway. The second question's a better one, and one. I feel like the popcorn on the couch question you asked earlier, where, I mean, I really actually enjoy reading other people's arguments either way on that subject, about whether or not, it's the old line about whether the First World War is part one, and then you have an intermission where everybody gets to, I think we recently compared it to like a boxing match, where the First World War is the first round, the intermediary years you go get back to your corner, they tell you what the other guy's doing, they give you some strategy tips, they rinse your face off, you get a chance to catch your breath, and then boom, you're out there for part two. The difference to me is and maybe I'm putting too much emphasis on it, let's acknowledge that right away. I see the government types as so different that to me it changes the basic nature of it, with for the First World War being such a nationalist, nation-state oriented one, and the second one seemingly having much more ideological overtones. Now, that doesn't mean it can't be part two, but that changes. I mean, if you still had if part two, if the Second World War were also fought with Wilhelmine Germany, Tsarist Russia, and all that, then I think it's absolutely probably part two. But I almost think that new entities, and I'm hardly the only person to almost think this, but that new entities were created from the rubble of what the First World War killed. And I mean, in the case of the Soviet Union, created during the First World War still, right? It didn't even have to end for that creation to start. And those entities fighting the Second World War, I mean, to get to our boxing analogy, in my mind, it's not the same boxer, right? It's a different, you substituted the boxer that fought in round one with a different one in round two. Now, it's still Germany, but are the Nazis the Kaiserreich? Well, no. And how much different do they have to be before they're not the same boxer? I think that's why I'd like to hear other people's arguments about it. If you forced me, if you put me up against a wall and said pick, I would say it's not part two, but I'm open to being convinced otherwise. How's that for playing both sides of the fence?
Yeah, very diplomatic.
Yes, I could get us into a world war with that kind of diplomacy, couldn't I?
Because there's, just as I say, whether we're still dealing with the ripples of it, because some people would argue, I suppose, that enough events have transpired that we're dealing with ripples, for example, say the post-Glasnost era, we're really dealing with ripples that are Cold War ripples now. They themselves might have been caused by World War II, which was caused by World War I, but then how far do you go back? Are we saying we're not suffering from the ripples of the Napoleonic era? So, yeah, I mean, it's how far do you want to go down the rabbit hole?
Well, what about maps and oil, though? I mean, let's just say maps and oil. I think those are both holdover, we'll call them legacy issues from the First World War. And if you say those are old issues. I would suggest, though, that listen, the Gulf War with Saddam Hussein dealing with Kuwait and all that kind of stuff. I mean, that's not even and maybe again, I'm open to correction, but that doesn't even look like you don't need too many steps to tie that directly into map making, the need to have oil, colonial possession. I mean, and maybe that's what it is. Maybe the fact that colonialism is so tied up in the First World War, and that the First World War did so much damage to colonialism, and we've spent so much of the 20th century especially unraveling that. So maybe that's, and maybe that gives, and to play the opposite side of the devil's advocate here, maybe that gives us the impression that this is really a First World War ripple, when maybe the First World War is a ripple in the whole colonial question. I don't know.
We're getting into James Burke territory.
Yes, we are.
It's very easy to get lost in that sort of thing, isn't it?
And you have to have a mind like James Burke to keep it straight, and I don't.
I'll do one more of these, Dan. I don't want to test your patience, but imagine it's 1914. The Imperial German Army has got through Belgium. They've taken that bastion at Liège, and they're closing on the Marne. Now imagine there's no allies, and they're replaced by 2020 spec Apache gunships. How many do you think roughly it would take to stop the Imperial German Army? I mean, how many men are we talking about? A couple of million even? I think it would take quite a few. But again, I've had wildly different answers from people on that.
Well, that is a different story, because that First World War German army is a different animal entirely than those ancient armies that you threw at me before. I think here's the problem. The problem is going to be that those Apache gunships can attack an enemy that have no ability to see them.
Yeah.
They can do it from beyond the horizon. They can do it in complete darkness. They can do it. They can see that. That's tough. I do think that becomes an ammunition question, because I mean, are you giving them unlimited ammunition, or because otherwise, they can do a lot of damage, but once they're out of ordnance, they're done.
Yeah, a lot of people have asked me that. I've said, maybe imagine there's some sort of a depot just north of Paris with infinite ammo and fuel, but they do have to go back.
Space aliens, yeah. I mean, then that is War of the Worlds, and I don't know how many it takes, but. And I do think what they would do is they would just, because you can look at examples that might give you tiny little clues, right? So maybe the mass introduction of tanks, for example. That's a revolution in military affairs that happened in that war that you can look at and say, well, how'd the German army deal with that? And it was obviously there were quite a few tanks in those early battles, especially the ones that matter. But it was a game changer right there, and that's early 20th century technology, right? That's contemporary technology. So I think that I don't think it takes many gunships at all. If you have the unlimited depot thing, it takes one. Just
really
moving up and down the front, bashing everything until there's nothing left to bash.
And it's essentially impervious. I mean, of course, the Germans wouldn't have any smart munitions, have they?
It's impervious to detection. Forget about impervious to counterattack.
Well, I've got to ask you about the Ost Front, if I may. Sure. It was a tour de force, Dan. It's tour de force.
They're all tour de forces. I don't believe you anymore, Bo.
But I've got to ask you this, because, of course, it's one of the classic blunders, isn't it, to try a land invasion across that part of Asia. But if you were to do it, say you were, Hitler, I suppose, just before they invade, do you think it's doomed to failure? Would you have one thrust to Moscow? Would you, because they had three main thrusts, didn't they, up to Leningrad, Moscow, and the south one ended up in Stalingrad? What would you do if it were you?
It's based on assumptions that didn't turn out to be true. Right. I think that's your problem. And listen, it didn't mean that they didn't have to be true, but remember, the idea was, and if you wanted to, you could almost talk. I always I had a professor of history who tried to get you. This also goes back to your earlier question about How do you get into the minds of people from different time periods successfully with your own biases in the way? And one of the ways that you have to get into their thinking is by saying, okay, so in their memory banks of a person their age, what do they remember? And in the case of someone like Hitler or the high command that was on his side, because not all the high command was on his side, these are people that remembered how quickly and how unstable the government of Russia was in the First World War. It was their assumption that the Soviet government was no more stable than that. And so their hope is for a similar outcome where, due to a consistent pounding or battlefield victories or what have you, the state collapses. I think Hitler said like a rotten structure or something. In other words, translated, he means he's waiting for the morale of the state to collapse, and it kind of did in the First World War. So he's looking for that kind of an outcome. Of course, the unwritten assumption here is that what if you're wrong about that, right? If they don't collapse, what do things look like, right? How far back? I mean, even if you take Moscow, I mean, Napoleon took Moscow. The Russians burned it. So you didn't have a place to sleep in the winter. I'm not sure. Now, everybody always talks to me. I've had many of these arguments about what a transportation hub Moscow was during the Soviet era, and all the railroads converged there, blah, blah, blah. The Germans are going to have a lot of problems with partisans. If the state does not collapse, the Wehrmacht is in trouble. And part of the reason the state is not collapsing is because they'll kill you if it collapses. And there's a lot of and every time I say that, I get complaints from Russians who point out that the huge amounts of patriotic fervor that were felt by people, and that's absolutely true. And one of the things that the information that's come out of the fall of the old Soviet Union that historians have had quite a bit of time now to assess is that was more true than we gave it credit for here in the West. And if I was going to redo Ghost of the Ostfront today, I would take more advantage of sources that are available now that were not available then, and modify, not change, because the views that we expressed were true. But it's important, just like we talked earlier, to try to give as many lenses and viewpoints as possible. And the idea of the Soviet and especially Russian resistance, and the Nazis turned a lot of people who would have been their friends against them. Let's recognize that. In the First World War, they would have treated, say, the Ukrainians and the Poles and everything much, much differently, and it would have made a big difference. In this case, we know this was a race war between Untermenschen, Slavs, and a master race. You were never going to have some wonderful deal worked out for everyone's benefit, right? And in that case, then I think if the Russians don't surrender, the Soviets don't surrender, then it becomes like an Adam Tooze book, The Wages of Destruction or something, where you're looking at the questions now of raw materials, oil production, population, and that's where the Soviets are putting so many new troops in uniform and churning out relatively cheap and relatively simple compared to their German counterparts equipment. And then they're getting supplies from the Allies, and the Germans are fighting on multiple fronts. I don't see that. Their only hope is that it collapses like a house of cards, because otherwise, I think trouble.
Yeah, no. Good call. Yeah, it was always going to be tough. It's always an ask.
Their morale, and they're going to break you eventually. If this gets into a long war, you're screwed.
That bit about the bone fields, I hadn't really heard that before. That was a fantastic. Terrible, but fantastic.
And apparently a whole TV special on it or something, and I never caught that. But it was from Donovan Webster's book, where he talked about what these battlefields look like today. And he did a World War I battlefield, a First World War battlefield, a Second World War battlefield, one from Vietnam. He did a nuclear test site in Nevada. And it was freaking fascinating. And those bone fields, I think the minute he put the book out, every tourist in the world went there and tried to pick out a souvenir for themselves. And I read somewhere it became quite the cottage industry to go pick them clean of like war souvenirs to sell online. I bet those fields are nowhere near as extensive or obvious as they were 25 years ago when he wrote that book. I think it was about 25 years ago. I could be wrong about that.
It's quite macabre, but I would like to visit Volgograd. I would quite like to go there and see some of the places, although it is quite a dark thing to do.
But like you, I get that.
Do you think you could take an ancient general, let's say Hannibal, give him 3 months in West Point, and then he can actually function well as a commander in 1940?
I've read some stuff on that. That's a fascinating question, and I don't know the answer. I don't know how long it would take to get up to speed, and I don't know how translatable the skill sets are, right? Because you're talking about, I had read once about the American Civil War that because it was this modern war that required skills that no one knew you were going to need, that many of the great generals in that war turned out to be great generals because they serendipitously possessed those skills already. So I'm going from memory here, so I hope nobody kills me on this. But I mean, it was like Grant and Sherman, and a lot of these people had gone into private business and failed. One of them was a grocer, for example, and it meant nothing, right? So when the Civil War starts and they go back into uniform, apparently, again, going from memory here, being a grocer and understanding the logistics of how supplies in that field worked actually helped them be a better general in the war. So but they could not have envisioned that because they didn't know that skill set was going to be one you needed. So flash forward, can you take a general, and this is something Arthur Farrell, like I had mentioned, talked about in his book, The Origins of War. You take someone like an Alexander and you say, okay, the battlefield size Alexander was used to working with is this big. If he's going to fight this battle now, it's going to be that big. Can Alexander take the skills that served him so well on a smaller plane and apply them to the larger? I don't know. It starts getting into that question of tactics and strategies, and people who are better tacticians and people who are better strategists. This is where a question of Caesar and Alexander comes into my mind. I think when you have people who are mutants almost, and if you read Caesar, I think you could make a case he's like a savant or one of these people. I think someone like that has the ability to defy expectations, right? He's a wild card. So somebody like that might be able to do what most average, even people who are good generals. I mean, I'm not sure you could take most Second World War generals and have them fight a space force, and command the space force well. I just don't know. I don't know how much contemporary background info of the underpinnings of reality. How much do you have to understand gasoline, right, to be a general? Yeah. How much you have to understand, vehicles, and I don't know how much of that's required, or you're just going to be an idiot in reality,
Yeah, no, it's good. I mean, I always feel like someone like, say, Hannibal or Alexander's part of their genius, or part of why they won so often, was that they had a great eye. Or Wellington is a good example. They could just see the terrain and see, okay, this is a terrible place to have a battle. This is going to be a great place for me to have a battle. That bluff over there would be a great place to put cannons or whatever. And they see it all almost straight away, and that would still be valuable in, say, World War II.
Certainly, but let me stop you, because I agree 1,000%. But here's where it changes. What terrain means to you changes depending on capabilities. So if you're commanding a phalanx or 50,000 men that you want to keep relatively close together, that set of hills means one thing. If you're thinking about shooting artillery from 5 miles away into that valley that lies over those hills are still an important tactical feature, but in a different way. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So 3 months classroom training at West Point probably wouldn't cut it.
I don't know. I'd have to see, but I do think that it's like when in Star Trek or something, you have Spock has to relearn everything from scratch, and you have to. I mean, these are almost like stroke victims who have to come in and relearn how to talk. You'd have to bring them up and go, okay, before we talk about anything military, let's have a conversation about cell phones, or whatever. In 1940s, let's have a conversation about airplanes, right? You'd have to give them basic information that they could incorporate into their data set and into their calculations. And I don't know how long it takes for a time traveler to get up to speed,
Yeah, that's what you can't really ever know.
They're fascinating. I love the questions.
Oh, thank you very much. It's very kind of you.
Those are the subjects that history fans do talk about on their lunch break at college. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I've lived it.
Yeah, me too.
I wanted to ask you about the Indianapolis, because that was actually one of the similar to Prophets of Doom, both in the sense that I absolutely loved it, and that I was only vaguely aware of it. I've of course seen Jaws, where Robert Shaw mentions, the doll's eye.
That's one of my favorite scenes ever.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I was aware that what he was saying was a true story, but that's it. I didn't know any further detail. And so your episode on the Indianapolis was excellent. And I just wondered, one, again, why you particularly picked that. Was there any particular reason? And but also whether you had any foreboding about it, because of course there's survivors, aren't there still? And I know you've mentioned that. I know you've talked about it before, but that one is a particularly sort of terrible story, isn't it? It's particularly harrowing. And I wondered if you had any sort of misgivings before you did it.
We get the survivor thing in more stories than you would think. We had it on Ghosts of the Ostfront quite a bit, and
Yeah.
that was my first real feedback from participants, and I had not expected it, because you think, okay, well, those people are all old or gone. No, they're not. They're still around, and they speak English, or their grandchildren speak English, and so it was fascinating actually to get some of that feedback. And lucky for yours truly, it was positive, but it could have easily been the other way. On the Indianapolis story, the best way to describe the Indianapolis is that, if you're Australian, something like the Kokoda track or the Kokoda trail battles are enormously important in Australia, and they hardly know about them in the United States. There's lots of things like that, right? In the United States, the Indianapolis story is pretty well known because of, one, it's so horrifying, but two, there's always been a connection to, and they mentioned that in Jaws, in the monologue, Robert Shaw's monologue, was the connection to the delivering of the atomic bomb. And the connection to the fact that had they not been on a secret mission, those men probably would have been discovered, and it would have been realized that their ship had sunk a long time previously, and they would have not spent all that time in the water. So there was a direct connection to the fact that they were on a secret mission to deliver the atomic bomb, and the fact that their experience turns out to be horrible, because for those who don't know the Indianapolis story, there's a lot of elements to it, but all you have to know is a bunch of men get their ship sunk, have to spend a lot of days in the waters, the sharks find them, and they get to stay there while hundreds of men are being taken by the sharks day after day. And you have to live. I mean, it's one of those experiences where, if you want to try to imagine nightmarish scenarios that you might find yourself in, and depending on what bothers you the most, shark attacks are one of the things on my list that I don't like. Really don't like. That's your worst nightmare come true. And I didn't worry so much about blowback from veterans, because all we're doing with the veterans is really going, oh my God, how did these people endure this? So there's nothing, I don't think there's anything insulting about that. I think in some, no, but I mean, so I think in some ways, they'd rather have people talking about that than to have people forget what the hell, not just what they went through, but the people that never came home from that experience, that the people who did come home from that experience would like to think would never be forgotten,
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
a really convoluted answer. I apologize.
No, I appreciate it. Say you're Harry Truman, and Roosevelt has just died, and you're being briefed for the first time, and they tell you about the Manhattan Project, and that they plan to, the chiefs want to drop the bomb as soon as they can, more or less. And you're you, as you are now, you've quantum leaped into Truman's body. Would you try and stop it at all, or would you go along with the policy of dropping it? I mean, how do you feel about that?
Well, I've done a whole show based on that idea, because here in the States, we talk about it. It's often debated, the wisdom of dropping the bomb. And, I'm going to do the same thing I do with all of our questions. If this is me, if you take me in a time capsule, put me in Truman's body as I am now, knowing what I know now, I would certainly try to not have to drop the bomb. Partly because I would be unwilling, but again, these people the part that I always try to recall is how many people are dying every day in the Second World War. I mean, they're dying because when we look at the numbers of death from any specific incident by itself in a vacuum, it's horrifying. But when you say to yourself, no, you don't understand how many thousands of people are dying every day like clockwork. It's not like they have this battle and a bunch of people die and then there's nothing. It's every day. It's what they called in the First World War wastage, right? It's the everyday levels of casualties everywhere. So the theory of the people who always want to get things over with quick, the strategic bomber types and all that, is that every day you cut off of that timeline, right? Every day you shorten the war cuts that vast number that's dying every day down. shorter wars kill fewer people, right? And the argument was on their side that the more nasty they are is a necessary evil to shorten the war, which saves lives. Not everybody believes that. Yours truly would find that to be very slight justification to drop a bunch of bombs on civilians like that. But I try again to remind myself that if I did not drop that bomb, the Tokyo firebombing attacks are still ongoing. They happened after the atomic bombs were dropped. There were firebombing attacks. So if you're saying to me, Dan Carlin, Harry Truman, Dan Truman, Carlin, Harry, you're not going to drop the atomic bomb, but that means that they're still going to do the firebombing attacks. I'm not sure I've done any good. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I suppose maybe to zoom out a little, the best thing, if you wanted to minimize misery, would be to maybe change the policy of insisting on absolute surrender. I mean, because it wasn't an absolute surrender in the end, right? I mean, because the Japanese emperor was never removed or put on trial, so there was some condition. Maybe it's the whole war-winning policy might have to change, but it's a tough call.
Well, and I think we always assume, and this is a truism almost no matter when and where you apply it, we always assume more flexibility on those people at the time, the decision makers, than they probably actually had. One of the things we speculated in the show we dealt with that subject on was what would have happened to Truman if he didn't drop that bomb, right? And
politically.
Yes. Well, first of all, I mean, if you are the parent of a child who dies in the war in 1946, and it turns out somebody could have dropped this bomb on the bad guys, that's the way we would have seen it, in 1945 and ended that war, how angry are you going to be? How outraged? And an enormous amount of treasure went into and opportunity costs went into the making of the bomb. If you didn't use it, there were going to be a bunch of people who would do the equivalent of accuse you of some sort of neglect or malpractice or something like that. So I think I always try to recall how much easier it is to make that decision now than it would have been then, and how easy it would seem to just say, hey, I'm the commander in chief, we're not dropping it. I'm not sure that would have been the end of the story, you know?
Yeah, no, absolutely right. I mean, it's well and good, one thing to sort of pose a hypothetical question like that, but the reality is ridiculously complicated.
Even now, if you say, why aren't people doing X today? And a lot of times, if you really want to study the subject, you'll find, well, there's all kinds of reasons that might explain it. And the problem with history, as we all know, is the farther away you get from events, all the minor little things, the gray areas, the nuance, that stuff tends to get lost the farther away from those events you get. That's normal. I mean, you can't write a history book that has every little teeny thing that's ever happened in it. But at the same time, I think it gives we moderns a mistaken impression sometimes of the kind of options we would have had if we were living then.
Yeah. I want to ask you about the Destroyer of Worlds. I thought that was it was a tour de force, DC.
It was a tour de force, absolutely.
There was a specific bit in that which I thought was excellent, where you played an actual original recording of Curtis LeMay, I suppose, in the Oval Office with JFK.
Yeah, XCOM tapes. Yeah, those are great.
I thought that was really good. There was a bit when he accuses him of appeasement, and you actually talk over saying, shots fired right there. I thought that was excellent. If I could give you my 2 pennies worth, I think if you do stuff like that more, I really liked it anyway. But I want to ask you just straight up, who do you think, if you had to put money on it, killed JFK? I mean, I've heard you speak to Joe Rogan about it. But I just wondered if you really, had to put some money on it, who would you go for? What's your idea?
I've changed my mind on that subject. I'd like to say the same thing I've said about all those kinds of questions, which I'm not sure. I don't pretend to know. I used to think it was a pretty clear-cut case of something going on that was fishy. I'm not sure anymore. And I know Joe differs with me on this because we differed on it on the last show we had. And he started getting into magic bullets and all that stuff. And that you can get lost in the weeds pretty quickly with that stuff. I tend to think when in doubt, there's an Occam's razor thing that kicks in. I always think that if you're going to go against that, the evidence needs to be pretty good. And one of the things that upset me with some of the books that came out in the 1990s, which was the first time I think we saw some intellectual pushback against some of the more conspiratorial theories, was what was left out in so many of the books that I had read that were pushing one of, there's so many different conspiracy ideas. It was the mob, it was the CIA, it was the CIA with the mob, it was there's always a lot of those things, but a lot of those books left out key information. And when that was exposed in the other books from the 1990s and later, it says, what this guy didn't tell you, but that the author knew, it made you question them. Like they weren't being fair brokers with you in a lot of these books. Like they knew that they had stuff that would make their own theories look bad, so they didn't include them in the book. Stuff like that tends to make me, puts a little bit more weight on the Occam's razor side of the scales for me at that point. And so that's kind of what began to change my mind when you kind of go, listen, the best likelihood here is that Oswald probably did this. And then you can start asking questions. Okay, did Oswald do this for somebody else? I think if I had to say and go percentage, because I think that's the best way to phrase how I feel about this, I'd go 70-30. 70% Oswald did it alone because, for all of the old reasons, 30% that there was some sort of conspiracy. I do think we have to remember one of the things that I had asked as a younger person that I thought was a good point that made my case that I thought Kennedy was assassinated by some sort of conspiracy was, why did the Warren Commission so obviously leave stuff out? Or why did the Warren Commission, there were a bunch of things where you go, in the same way I just said I thought it was suspicious of pro-conspiracy authors to leave stuff out that didn't validate their opinion. I always thought it was suspicious that, why would Johnson do something that looks like a cover-up here, right? President, all these kinds of things. Only later did it occur to me, and a smarter person would have picked up on this at an earlier age, but we work with what we work with, would have realized that, listen, we're in the middle of a Cold War. We're in really, you had talked about the Destroyer of Worlds. That XCOM incident was only about a year or so before Kennedy's assassination. So that is the level of tension, right? Year or two. So the level of tension is literally, we're going to push the button and end hundreds of millions of lives, destroy civilization. So that's the level of threat we're talking about here. If the American people find out that a beloved president is murdered in front of his wife by somebody who is a friend of the communists in Russia, who defected there, who might be seen as working for, all of a sudden I started to realize, okay, there are very few reasons I ever think government secrecy and cover-up makes sense. But if you told me that it prevented World War III, because all you have to do is look at how World War I's lead up got out of control and out of human hands so quickly. The momentum, the impetus, the inertia begins. If you're Johnson, I think you're thinking that if this spirals out of control, if Jack, I think you could argue that maybe you would be forced or herded or pressured into a level of, we're dealing with Vietnam even, with the Soviets backing the other. So I do think that's a moment fraught with potential danger. And if you wanted to say we felt like it was too dangerous of a situation to release all of our information as we wondered about it, I think you might have a good case. So that's why I waver on that a little bit. That's another long-winded answer, but I've actually thought a lot. I don't think I'm intelligent or knowledgeable about it, but I've thought a ton about it. Let's just say it's an evolving point of view, and I await more evidence.
I feel very much the same. I just don't have enough data.
Yes.
But I actually
and the data has been corrupted too. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah. I think of it actually the other way around. I think maybe 30%, I think it's a good, decent chance Oswald acted alone. But I put 70% on that not being the case.
You might be right.
My eye of suspicion falls upon one Mr. Alan Dulles, but that's just me. Okay. I could talk about this for a while.
You're the military-industrial complex. That's where you go with it.
Well, I just feel like it would. There's just a few details that you would have needed someone at the very top of government to be making some decisions to make these things happen. That seems to be unavoidable. And I feel like Jack kicked Dulles upstairs, didn't he? Sort of fired him from his job, and I don't think Alan Dulles took too kindly to that. And well, one of the things I talked to my dad. My dad's an American. He's actually from Oregon,
Oh, there
incidentally.
you go.
And I said to him, this was years ago, before when I knew a lot less about it. I said something about Earl Warren, that he's whitewash, and my dad said, no, you've got it wrong. He was whiter than white. He was completely beyond reproach. Of course, the Warren Commission is a whitewash, but it wouldn't have been him. So I feel like maybe it was a few very senior people like Dulles and LBJ, sort of at the very kernel of it all, at the very heart of everything. But I mean, it's just a weird story, isn't it? There's so many things that just don't seem to add up.
My mentor in journalism, and the one thing I always hate about the internet being invented when it was, is you can do the smallest things in life and the internet will now remember you for the rest of eternity. There are people who did huge things when I was a kid who've been like lost to history because they did it before the internet was invented. One of those guys was my mentor in news, a journalistic legend at the time, but a bit of a dinosaur by the time I was working with him. He was really old school, and his name was John Babcock. And John had all these different run-ins with history, but my favorite one was that he was a reporter in Texas, and he was in the motorcade when Kennedy was shot. And he was in, like, he said, we were in the way, way back. He goes, I didn't even know. I was there, and I didn't know what happened. I didn't see anything. But he was in the motorcade, and then he was one of the first people at Parkland Hospital because they all knew the beat and they knew where he would be taken. And he was also in the room when Ruby shot Oswald, and he'd just been talking to Ruby, and they all knew Ruby. That was he said, we called him Jack, right? He and so when you talk about being at that was what I always wanted to do. That was my reason for being in journalism, was as a history nut. I wanted to have the opportunity to put myself in a situation where history was happening and I was there, right? The Hindenburg catches on fire and you're the guy with the microphone who's there to see it. I always wanted to be a war correspondent. Now I'm so glad I didn't. But it was the same idea, right? See it head on, be there. And John, my mentor, he knew Manson. I mean, there were so many stories, and you just thought to yourself, wow, what a colorful life this guy. Talked to Jack Ruby minutes before Ruby. So that's my claim on that story. And I think John probably would have called it a conspiracy, but he would have said that Ruby wasn't in on it, I bet.
Right, yeah. I mean, he seems like some sort of stooge character to me. But still, it's getting many questions that don't seem to add up.
Well, you know what's funny is it might have worked out the same way. I mean, just taking your theory, right? Let's imagine it's Dulles and those guys. They might have been fine with Oswald going to trial, saying, I'm a patsy, I didn't do it, having the jury said, yes, you did, boom, you're executed. I mean, they might never have had to plan to have Oswald knocked off because Oswald might just sound like a raving lunatic to a jury at the time, you know? So your theory there's a lot of ways that could break, right?
Yeah. I mean, it's possible that it's a comedy of errors, that there are several strange things happening at once, and there's not necessarily a vast web of conspiracy going on. It is just a really weird set of events. But although that's possible, I just don't.
It always looks extra difficult when your little brother runs for president and gets assassinated also.
Oh, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly.
It makes you a little bit more suspicious.
Well, there was a spate of political assassinations, weren't there, all around that period? You know, it wasn't. It was it lends itself to the idea that there's a rogue element of assassins. It sounds crazy, doesn't it, to say it? But God.
Well, you know what though? I remember during the big cocaine wars in the 80s, and I remember somebody talking about how at a certain point, killing people just makes good sense. That's the way he put it. And he was talking about money. Like once you reach, and if you're one of these cocaine wars people, once it's a question of $40,000, right? You kill somebody for that. I think maybe that applies in government too. That maybe most people don't want the possible blowback that comes with that, but there's a line in the sand, and if you go beyond that, threaten my interest, threaten this, threaten that, you become expendable. It's like I was wondering about something like that the other day, where you ask yourself, okay, at what point Is it worth risking somebody thinking you may have done something like this rather than have, the alternative, right? Is it better to have to do something like go after Jeffrey Epstein and have everybody think you did it than to have him go on the stand and implicate all of you? Might be, different people weigh these things differently, but at a certain point, like the cocaine wars guy said, once it reaches a certain amount of money, they consider the decision made.
Yeah, I think of Remo Gadget in the film Casino when they ask whether they should murder some witnesses or not, and he just shrugs. It's like, why take the chance? Yes, just do it.
Yeah, so depending on whether or not you're going to get caught for it, yeah, it becomes a business decision, like they say in those movies.
You mentioned being like a war correspondent. Obviously, of course, I've heard your interview with Max Hastings, and it was excellent. I wonder if just in the broad strokes of the brush here, talking about Vietnam, whether you think it's quite a subjective question to answer, but whether you think it was a just war, or your concept of just war, if you think there can be such a thing, or not. What are your feelings on that?
I am not a person who thought the Vietnam War was a good war to have fought, but that ties into my own political beliefs. And this is not something, by the way, that's a modern guy looking back on this saying, that this is how I feel now. I was never a fan of that war, but my political persuasion in the United States personally is not to go abroad, as they used to say back in the old days, in search of monsters to slay. So I'm not one of those people who thinks that the United States military was designed and thought of in terms of going across giant oceans. It's just to me, and I've always said I want the United States to have a foreign policy like the vast majority of everybody else. I'm a fan of the military doing what I want them to do. I sometimes question what the situations they're put into, and the Vietnam War was a perfect example of the kind of situation where I would go, listen, we can talk about ways to help South Vietnam, but I'm drawing the lines at putting American troops in there to die. I mean, that's just where it would be for me. So in answer to your question, is it a just war? Well, if you said we fought to save a bunch of people from being enslaved, well, I think that's a good cause. But I don't know that, if you take on that task, when does that end, right? That's the foreign monsters to slay. It's like saying, I think I should give my money to charity. Yeah, but at what point do you say, I shouldn't give any more money to charity, or I'm going to be needing charity? I'm a fan of the slogans and the ideas that we fought for, but I'm not sure that's the way to do it. And I would like to suggest that there's multiple ways to get to the same goal. And considering how that whole thing turned out, I think it's easy to say now that wouldn't have been the way to do it. But no, and that's my own political biases. I wouldn't have been in Vietnam, but there's a lot of places I wouldn't have been in. So.
Yeah, no, nice bit of John Quincy Adams to end on.
That's exactly. And funny thing is, I was talking about John Quincy Adams just the other day. So thing to end on.
Or actually, if I could just ask one last question, you can be very brief if you like. And it's quite a loaded question, but what are your feelings on iconoclasm?
It has its place. This gets back to what we talked about earlier. I like having all the different elements in play. If you look at them as like societal forces, I think they create a certain societal equilibrium, right? You're building, you're tearing down, you're preserving all at the same time. And I think that to have any one without the other creates an imbalance. I think you need your hagiography, your people who laud our heroes, and I think you need your people that question the heroes and flesh them out. And I think all these people create stasis. And I think we as human beings continually go overboard in every direction. And then you have a reformation, and then you have a counter-reformation, right? So you have a countervailing force that then springs up, and hopefully, I think some of our worst cases in history are when you don't get the countervailing force acting strongly enough, and something goes into French Revolution territory for a short time, right? Somebody would suggest, though, that even that might have served a purpose of permanently changing certain things. Again, this is one of those wonderful things history people love talking about. And I could do this forever. There are no right answers. But maybe that's better. It's easier to get a good grade in class if there's no right answers, right?
Right, yeah. I
That's
relied on that.
unforgiving, baby.
Well, Dan, thank you very, very much for your time. It goes without saying, it's massively appreciated. There's no reason for you to do it other than altruism. And
This is, what this is paying, just so you know, because you should know, this is paying it forward. This is doing for you what people did for me. And that's how I look at it. So just so, and I appreciate your time. I appreciate all the kind words. You've been very kind, but look, we're all kind of in this together. And that's how I look at it. So I appreciate you having me on. You've been a very gracious host, and I hope your listeners like the show.
yeah, well, me too. I'm sure they will. Yeah, so thanks again. I hope you have a nice evening. And if it's not too cheeky, hopefully I can speak to you again someday.
Yeah, hopefully after you do this show, your listeners want you to. We'll see how that goes. Stay safe, my friend. I appreciate your time.
Take care.
Bye-bye.